Catherine de' Medici's name has long been synonymous with intrigue, power, and controversy. Known as the Black Queen of France, she remains one of history's most fascinating and misunderstood figures. Born into the powerful Medici family, Catherine's journey from a young, orphaned Italian princess to one of the most influential women in 16th-century Europe was anything but conventional. Amid political strife, religious wars, and a complex royal court, she maneuvered her way to the heart of French power, skillfully balancing her role as wife, mother, and regent. Yet, despite her resilience and political savvy, her legacy is tainted by myths of poison, witchcraft, and bloodshed, painting her as a villain in the eyes of many. But who is the real Catherine de' Medici? A ruthless manipulator, or a woman whose actions were driven by a desperate need to protect her family and her kingdom? To truly understand her legacy, one must look beyond the legends and see the woman behind the throne. Catherine de' Medici is one of the most controversial and enigmatic figures in European history. Born into the powerful and wealthy Medici family of Florence in 1519, her life would come to be entwined with the fate of France during one of its most violent and turbulent periods. She rose from a precarious childhood, an orphan surrounded by political enemies, to become the queen consort of France, the queen mother to 3 successive kings, and ultimately, one of the most influential political figures of her age. Yet despite her significant role in steering the fate of the French monarchy, Catherine's legacy has been shaped more by legend and rumor than by straightforward historical fact. Over the centuries, she has been portrayed as a Machiavellian schemer, a master of poisons, and a practitioner of dark arts, earning her the ominous nickname, the Black Queen. The title, the Black Queen, reflects not only Catherine's association with mourning and death, having lost her husband, children, and political control amidst endless wars, but also the aura of fear and suspicion that surrounded her. She was often depicted dressed in black mourning attire, a symbol of both her personal tragedies and the constant funerals that defined her reign. More than just her physical appearance, however, it was the perception of her as a manipulative and ruthless figure that solidified her dark image. Throughout her lifetime and long after her death, her enemies and critics painted her as a shadowy figure orchestrating political murders, religious massacres, and court intrigues. Whether these accusations were fair or exaggerated remains a matter of debate, but what is clear is that Catherine navigated a world where survival often demanded ruthless pragmatism, especially for a woman wielding power in an intensely patriarchal society. Catherine's influence over France was profound. When her husband, King Henry II, died in a tragic jousting accident, she found herself thrust into a position of immense responsibility. Her sons, who each succeeded to the throne in rapid succession, were young, inexperienced, and often physically or mentally fragile. As Queen Mother, Catherine served as regent and advisor, often exercising the real power behind the throne. Her political skill was critical during the French Wars of Religion, a series of bloody conflicts between Catholics and Protestants that tore the kingdom apart. She tirelessly worked to maintain the authority of the crown, maneuvering between powerful noble factions and attempting to broker peace between religious groups whose hatred for one another frequently erupted into open violence. Yet it was precisely during these desperate efforts to keep France from disintegrating that Catherine's name became linked to some of the most infamous events in French history. Chief among them was the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of 1572, a catastrophic event in which thousands of Huguenots, French Protestants, were slaughtered in Paris and across the kingdom. Many accused Catherine of orchestrating the massacre, seeing it as the ultimate proof of her cruelty and duplicity. Whether she directly planned the killings or was herself caught up in the uncontrollable violence remains unclear, but the massacre indelibly stained her reputation. It also reinforced the widespread European perception of Catherine as a sinister, dangerous woman whose actions could not be trusted, a perception that would only grow as Protestant writers and Catholic opponents alike sought to demonize her. Catherine's controversial image was compounded by the widespread belief that she engaged in occult practices. Her court was home to astrologers like Nostradamus, whose prophecies she valued, and she was known to consult horoscopes and engage in mystical rites. In an era already suspicious of women in power, such associations only further fueled rumors that she used sorcery to achieve her ends. Accusations of poisonings and dark magic, common charges against powerful women at the time, were woven into her legend, blurring the line between political reality and imaginative fiction. Over time, These stories became so deeply entrenched that disentangling the real Catherine from the myths proved nearly impossible. To understand Catherine de' Medici fully, one must first grasp the historical landscape of 16th-century France. It was a kingdom riddled with instability, divided along religious lines, and plagued by ambitious noble families who challenged royal authority at every turn. The Reformation had swept across Europe, and France was no exception. Protestant ideas took hold among many nobles, setting the stage for violent clashes with the Catholic majority. The monarchy, already weakened by internal strife and financial problems, faced constant threats from both religious factions and foreign powers like Spain and England. In this context, Catherine's actions, which today might seem ruthless or immoral, were often desperate measures aimed at preserving not only her family's dynasty but also the very survival of the French state. Unlike many of her male counterparts, Catherine had to walk an even finer line. As a woman, her authority was constantly questioned. As a foreigner, she was often mistrusted by the French nobility. And as a regent, she had to navigate court politics with exceptional cunning. She did not have the luxury of ruling from a position of strength. Instead, she governed through negotiation, manipulation, and sometimes brutal force, always trying to hold the center together in a kingdom veering toward collapse. Her political maneuverings, arranging strategic marriages, shifting alliances, brokering peace treaties, were often the only barriers standing between France and complete anarchy. Thus, the story of Catherine de' Medici is not simply one of cruelty or ambition, as many of her detractors would have it. It is the story of a woman fighting to survive and protect her children in a world that offered her little kindness and demanded extraordinary sacrifices. It is a tale of resilience, intelligence, and tragic miscalculation, set against the backdrop of one of the most violent and complex periods in European history. If she was a Black Queen, it was in part because the times demanded it and because history and legend often judges women in power by harsher standards than their male counterparts. In re-examining Catherine de' Medici, we find not only a pivotal figure in the story of France, but also a revealing mirror held up to the fears, biases, and brutal realities of her age. Her life was a relentless balancing act, and whether she succeeded or failed is a question that still provokes debate among historians today. What remains beyond doubt is that she shaped the destiny of France during one of its most critical chapters, and that her story continues to captivate, horrify, and fascinate the world centuries after her death. Catherine de' Medici was born on April 13, 1519, into the legendary Medici family of Florence, Italy, a family whose name had long been synonymous with power, wealth, and political influence. Her birth marked the continuation of a lineage that had produced popes, bankers, and rulers who shaped the course of European history. Catherine's father, Lorenzo de' Medici, known as Lorenzo II, was the Duke of Urbino and a scion of this illustrious family. Her mother, Madeleine de la Tour d'Auvergne, was a French noblewoman of high rank, further binding the Medici to the great houses of Europe. Yet Catherine's life, though born in privilege, began under the shadow of tragedy. Within weeks of her birth, both of her parents died, her mother succumbing to puerperal fever and her father likely to syphilis. Suddenly, the infant Catherine was left an orphan, albeit one with immense inherited wealth and prestige, but no immediate family to shelter her. Raised amid the splendor and dangers of Renaissance Italy, Catherine's early life was deeply influenced by the reach and vulnerabilities of her family's fortune. The Medici were not only famed patrons of the arts, but also key players in the volatile political landscape of Italy. Their banking empire, once the richest in Europe, conferred tremendous influence, yet it also made them targets of enmity among rival factions. Florence, a city that had long been a battleground for competing political interests, was a perilous place for a child associated with the ruling elite. Although she bore the name of the Medici, Catherine's personal situation was precarious from the outset, for in times of upheaval, family ties often offered little real protection. The first decade of Catherine's life unfolded against a backdrop of political instability and personal uncertainty. After the death of her parents, she fell under the protection of her paternal relatives and, most importantly, her uncle, Giulio de' Medici, who would ascend to the papacy as Pope Clement VII. Despite this powerful patronage, Florence was a city in turmoil. Anti-Medici factions continually rose against the family's rule, and Catherine was frequently treated as a political pawn rather than a cherished child. Her early years were spent largely in convents, both for her education and her safety. These institutions, while providing her with a basic education in literacy, religion, and etiquette, were also places of confinement. The upheavals of Florence's politics soon found their way directly into Catherine's young life. When the Medici were briefly ousted from power, she was seized by revolutionaries and at one point, even threatened with being turned into a street urchin or used as leverage in political negotiations. The child who would later become one of the most powerful women in Europe grew up knowing fear, instability, and the ever-present possibility of betrayal. Living in convents under conditions that oscillated between privilege and imprisonment, she learned early lessons about resilience, caution, and the fragility of power. Even as she suffered displacement and danger, she cultivated a poise and patience that would become her hallmark in later years. Fortune shifted again when her uncle, now Pope Clement VII, sought to use Catherine as a means to secure broader political alliances. Recognizing the value of an advantageous marriage, Clement negotiated a union that would elevate Catherine from a beleaguered Florentine princess to a future Queen of France. In 1533, at the age of 14, Catherine was betrothed to Henry, Duke of Orleans, the second son of King Francis I of France. This marriage was no mere romantic arrangement. It was a strategic alliance intended to solidify ties between the papacy and the French crown, two formidable powers seeking to outmaneuver the burgeoning threat of the Holy Roman Empire under Charles V. The negotiations for Catherine's marriage were complex, with Clement offering a substantial dowry, though he was never able to fully deliver on it. Nonetheless, the match was accepted, and Catherine prepared to leave Italy for the sophisticated but treacherous world of the French court. Her arrival in France was a momentous event, but it was not without its critics. Many at the French court looked down upon her, viewing her as a foreigner with dubious lineage and a less-than-adequate dowry. Although the Medici were enormously influential, they lacked the traditional royal bloodlines that many French nobles prized, and Catherine's presence was regarded with suspicion by some. At just 14, Catherine found herself thrust into a glittering but perilous new world. The French court was a place of immense wealth, refinement, and political scheming, and Catherine, though intelligent and resourceful, was at first an outsider. Her marriage to Henry, Duke of Orleans, was not a love match. It was a political union arranged by others for reasons of state. Henry himself showed little interest in his young bride. From the outset, his heart belonged to another, the elegant and much older Diane de Poitiers. Diane wielded a considerable influence over Henry, serving not just as his mistress, but also as his advisor and confidant. Catherine, meanwhile, was left on the periphery of her husband's affections, her role at court defined largely by her ability, or inability, to produce heirs. The coldness of her marriage was a source of both personal pain and political peril for Catherine. A queen or consort's primary duty was to secure the lineage by bearing sons, and Catherine's initial failure to conceive led to intense scrutiny and pressure. She became the subject of gossip, with whispers questioning her health, her fertility, and even her right to remain Henry's wife. In a court where fertility was almost a currency of power, Catherine's inability to deliver an heir made her vulnerable. Her position could have been easily supplanted had Henry sought an annulment in favor of a more fertile spouse. The threat of being cast aside loomed large over Catherine for many years, and it was only through a combination of patience, strategy, and eventually successful childbirth that she secured her place within the French royal family. Despite her marginalized status during the early years of her marriage, Catherine worked diligently to assimilate herself into French court life. She cultivated relationships, observed the intricate dynamics of power, and honed the skills of diplomacy and discretion that would later serve her so well. Her education, though limited by the standards of male counterparts, had been thorough enough to allow her to navigate the complex etiquette and intellectual culture of the Renaissance court. Moreover, her experiences of insecurity and exile during childhood had endowed her with a natural resilience and an acute understanding of the necessity of political survival. Catherine's fortunes began to change gradually as the years progressed. Eventually, after a prolonged period of infertility that lasted nearly a decade, she began to bear children, a total of 10, though not all survived to adulthood. Her first surviving son, born in 1544, was the future King Francis II. This not only secured her position, but also strengthened her influence at court. She was no longer merely the Italian girl with no royal blood. She was now the mother of future kings. Her motherhood became her greatest political asset, binding her irrevocably to the fate of the French monarchy. Yet even with the birth of heirs, Catherine's marriage remained emotionally barren. Henry's devotion to Diane de Poitiers never wavered, and Catherine had to reconcile herself to a life in which her husband's love and favor were largely denied her. This forced her to find power and fulfillment not through romantic attachment, but through her children and through political engagement. Her loyalty to her offspring would later drive her to extraordinary lengths, as she sought to protect their reigns in a kingdom riven by religious and civil wars. Thus, the origins of Catherine de' Medici, the Italian girl born in the turmoil of Florence, raised amid revolution, and thrust into the heart of French royal politics, formed the crucible in which her formidable character was forged. She was a survivor in every sense, of childhood loss, political exile, marital coldness, and courtly suspicion. The skills she learned during these years, adaptability, resilience, and a deep understanding of human nature, would become the bedrock of her political career. As queen, mother, and regent, she would draw on these hard-won lessons to navigate a life that would be marked by extraordinary triumphs, devastating tragedies, and an enduring reputation as one of history's most fascinating and controversial women. When Francis I of France died in 1547, the entire structure of the French monarchy shifted. His death not only ended a significant reign characterized by Renaissance splendor and prolonged wars, but also brought Henry, Catherine's husband, to the throne as King Henry II. With Henry's coronation, Catherine de' Medici became the queen consort of France, a position of immense symbolic importance but initially limited practical influence. Catherine had been preparing for this moment for years, quietly observing the court's dynamics, learning the nuances of diplomacy, and building relationships where she could. Yet, despite the elevation of her status, she remained largely sidelined in matters of power during her husband's reign. The king's heart, mind, and often political decisions were heavily influenced by his beloved mistress, Diane de Poitiers, who continued to dominate the royal court and even wielded unprecedented political authority for a woman who held no formal title. Catherine's transition from Duchess of Orleans to queen consort brought new expectations and obligations. She was expected to embody the virtues of queenship, modesty, piety, fecundity, and decorum, while supporting her husband's reign with grace and dignity. Yet in practice, her role remained constrained. She was often overshadowed not only by her husband, but also by the brilliant and commanding Diane. Catherine was forced to balance the public duties of a queen with the private indignities of being politically and personally secondary in the eyes of her husband and his court. Her early years as queen consort were a study in patience, restraint, and the slow, methodical accumulation of influence behind the scenes. Throughout this period, Catherine endured the dominance of Diane de Poitiers with a stoicism that masked her growing awareness of courtly politics. Diane, nearly 20 years Henry's senior, was not only his lover but also his advisor, controlling access to him and, by extension, to royal patronage and favor. Diane had the king's ear on matters of state and was even granted the crown jewels, a deeply symbolic gesture of trust and power. Catherine, meanwhile, was expected to remain decorous, performing ceremonial duties and producing heirs without drawing undue attention to her dissatisfaction. This marginalization could have embittered or crushed a lesser figure, but Catherine instead used this period as her political apprenticeship. Catherine's survival and eventual ascendancy owed much to her keen powers of observation and her ability to navigate the complex social hierarchies of the court. She cultivated alliances among courtiers, learned the delicate art of flattery, and studied the factional rivalries that characterized Henry's reign. Though she lacked direct political authority, she developed relationships with key figures in the government, the clergy, and among the noble houses, always careful not to appear overtly ambitious or disloyal to the king. Catherine also built her own household within the court, carefully selecting ladies-in-waiting and advisors who could serve her interests and provide her with intelligence about court intrigues. Importantly, Catherine recognized that her greatest source of power lay in her role as mother. Over the years, she bore Henry 10 children, 7 of whom survived infancy, a remarkable achievement in an era of high child mortality. Her children were not only future monarchs and royal consorts, but also political tools through whom she could exert influence. Catherine's fierce maternal instincts were matched by a shrewd understanding of the importance of dynastic alliances. She plotted advantageous marriages for her sons and daughters, forging ties with powerful European families and ensuring the survival of the Valois dynasty. Motherhood allowed Catherine to strengthen her political position significantly. She became the matriarch of a royal lineage that, in theory, guaranteed the continuity of the French monarchy. Each child represented not just a personal triumph over her earlier struggles with infertility, but also a means to cement alliances and assert influence over the future of France. Catherine's ambitions for her children were vast, and she became a fierce protector of their interests. She intervened in court disputes, advocated for their rights, and ensured they were raised with a strong sense of their royal duties. Yet, her ascent to true political power was still incomplete during Henry's lifetime. The catalyst for her rise came with a tragedy that shook the foundations of the French monarchy. In 1559, Henry II participated in a jousting tournament to celebrate the marriage of their daughter, Elizabeth, to Philip II of Spain. During the festivities, a lance splintered and pierced Henry's eye and brain, inflicting mortal injuries. Despite the best efforts of his physicians, Henry died after agonizing days of suffering, leaving behind a kingdom plunged into uncertainty and a court. Henry's death marked a profound turning point in Catherine's life and the history of France. With her husband gone, she emerged not just as the grieving widow, but as the queen mother to her 15-year-old son, Francis II, who now inherited the throne. Catherine was no longer a peripheral figure. She was the mother of the king and the de facto guardian of a vulnerable monarch. In the tumultuous period following Henry's death, France was beset by religious divisions, noble rivalries, and an unstable political climate that threatened the very fabric of the monarchy. The jousting accident had not only claimed the life of a king, but had also created a dangerous power vacuum. Francis II was young and inexperienced, and his reign immediately became a battleground for influence among powerful noble factions, notably the Guises, who sought to dominate the government through their control of the king. Catherine quickly understood that if she did not assert herself, she and her children would be at the mercy of these ambitious lords. Motivated by both maternal love and political necessity, Catherine began to step into the power vacuum with decisive action. She worked to position herself as the indispensable advisor to her son, asserting her rights as queen mother and regent in all but name. Catherine appealed to the sense of duty among the court and the broader nobility, emphasizing the need for unity and stability under the Valois crown. She navigated between competing factions, sometimes supporting the powerful Guises when necessary, but always mindful of maintaining her own authority and autonomy. Catherine's political acumen, honed during her years of relative obscurity, now came fully into play. She used her intelligence, charm, and network of alliances to solidify her place at the heart of French governance. At the same time, Catherine recognized that the greatest threat to the monarchy came from the deepening religious divide between Catholics and Huguenots, French Protestants. Tensions had been simmering for decades, but were now reaching a boiling point. As a Catholic herself, Catherine was committed to preserving the traditional religious order, but she was also pragmatic enough to understand that brutal repression could spark civil war. She initially sought a middle path, advocating for a policy of moderate tolerance that would preserve the monarchy while preventing widespread bloodshed. Nevertheless, her efforts at religious conciliation were constantly undermined by extremists on both sides, and the pressures on her young son's reign proved overwhelming. Francis II's frail health and weak personality made him an ineffectual ruler, and his early death in 1560, just a year after ascending the throne, further destabilized the kingdom. Once again, Catherine found herself at a critical juncture. Now the mother of Charles IX, a child king even younger and more impressionable than his brother. Catherine's role as queen mother took on even greater importance after Francis's death. As regent for Charles IX, she now wielded formal political authority. Her regency marked the true flowering of her political career, as she sought to balance the competing demands of noble factions, religious divisions, and foreign powers that looked to exploit France's internal weaknesses. Catherine's rise to power, therefore, was not the result of a single event, but a gradual, patient accumulation of experience, alliances, and authority. From the shadows of Henry's court, where she endured marginalization and personal humiliation, she emerged as a central figure in French politics, driven by a fierce determination to protect her children and the Valois dynasty. The tragedies and challenges she faced in these early years forged her into a political leader of formidable skill and resilience, qualities that would define her long and controversial reign during one of the most turbulent periods in French history. The death of Henry II left the throne of France to his 15-year-old son, Francis II, a delicate and sickly boy whose weak health made him ill-suited to the burdens of kingship. In the political maelstrom that followed, the Guise family, through Francis's marriage to Mary, Queen of Scots, a Guise niece, swiftly assumed dominance over the young monarch and thus over the entire court. The Guises, led by Francis, Duke of Guise, and Charles, Cardinal of Lorraine, were determined to establish their own supremacy in France. They acted swiftly and decisively, excluding Catherine de' Medici from real political power during the brief reign of her son. Catherine, however, did not confront the Guises openly. Instead, she practiced strategic patience, recognizing that an overt challenge to their authority would be dangerous and likely futile. She understood that her best course of action was to wait for an opportunity, meanwhile working quietly to ensure that she was indispensable to her son's personal and political life. Catherine maintained close ties to her son, offering maternal support and counsel, while simultaneously establishing relationships with nobles who resented the Guises' power. Though she was marginalized from direct governance, she observed, learned, and prepared. She mastered the art of court intrigue, slowly building alliances that would later serve her well. Francis II's reign was brief and troubled. His health declined rapidly, and by late 1560, he succumbed to a painful infection of the inner ear. His death left France once again in a precarious position, with his younger brother, Charles IX, only 10 years old. The monarchy was fragile, threatened from within by noble factions and religious divisions, and from without by hostile foreign powers. In this moment of chaos, Catherine acted decisively. She secured the regency for herself, arguing that as the Queen Mother she was best positioned to safeguard the kingdom until Charles came of age. Assuming the regency was a political masterstroke for Catherine, yet it brought with it enormous challenges. France was a kingdom on the verge of collapse. The Protestant Reformation had taken deep root among significant portions of the population, especially in the South, and the old Catholic nobility was divided between those who sought compromise and those who demanded harsh repression of heresy. Moreover, powerful noble houses, the Guises, the Bourbons, and the Montmorencys, were engaged in a deadly contest for supremacy, each eager to control the crown and the direction of national policy. Catherine approached her regency with remarkable political acumen. She sought to position herself as a neutral arbiter among the warring factions, emphasizing her role as protector of the monarchy and the kingdom rather than as a partisan of any one religious or political cause. She convened the Estates General in 1560 in an attempt to address the kingdom's financial and religious crises. Though the assembly produced few tangible results, it was a demonstration of her willingness to engage with the broader political community rather than relying solely on court factions. Recognizing that religious conflict threatened the very survival of France, Catherine pursued a policy of limited tolerance, hoping to craft a compromise that would allow Catholics and Protestants to coexist peacefully. The Edict of January 1562 was one such effort, granting limited rights of worship to Huguenots, French Protestants, while reaffirming Catholicism as the state religion. However, this policy pleased no one fully. Catholics viewed it as a betrayal, while Protestants saw it as insufficient. Despite her genuine efforts at conciliation, Catherine's policies were overtaken by events beyond her control. In 1562, the massacre of Vassy, in which Catholic forces under the Duke of Guise slaughtered Protestant worshippers, ignited the French Wars of Religion, a series of bloody civil wars that would engulf France for decades. Catherine was forced to abandon her initial hopes for peaceful coexistence and adopt a more pragmatic, often brutal, approach to governance. She maneuvered constantly, shifting alliances as necessary, striving always to preserve the Valois monarchy amid the growing chaos. Throughout these turbulent years, Catherine remained a tireless diplomat. She convened religious colloquies such as the Colloquy of Poissy, hoping to find theological compromises between Catholics and Protestants, though these efforts largely failed. She issued edicts, revoked them when circumstances changed, and sought to play noble factions against each other to prevent any single group from becoming too powerful. Her regency was marked by constant motion, constant negotiation, and constant danger. At the heart of Catherine's political strategy was marriage diplomacy. She recognized that advantageous marriages could strengthen the monarchy, forge alliances, and create opportunities for peace. One of her most ambitious projects was to secure a marriage between her youngest son, the Duke of Anjou, and Queen Elizabeth I of England. Negotiations between the French and English courts dragged on for years, filled with elaborate pageantry, promises, and betrayals. Catherine deployed all her skill to present her son as an attractive suitor. Handsome, Catholic but moderate, and politically valuable. She hoped that such a marriage would cement a powerful alliance against Spain and stabilize France's position in Europe. Despite elaborate efforts on both sides, the proposed marriage to Elizabeth ultimately failed. Elizabeth, ever cautious, balked at tying herself to a Catholic consort and to the complex web of French politics. Moreover, personal reservations about the young Duke of Anjou, including rumors about his effeminate manners and suspected sexual proclivities, made the match unpalatable to the English court. Still, Catherine's attempt demonstrated her far-sighted approach to foreign policy, her understanding that France's internal weakness required strong external alliances. Undeterred, Catherine continued to use marriage as a tool of diplomacy. She arranged marriages for her daughters to the rulers of Spain and Lorraine, and sought advantageous matches for her sons to bolster the Valois position. Each marriage was a calculated move on the European chessboard, designed to counterbalance the Habsburgs, the Protestant states, and the internal divisions of France itself. Beyond marriage politics, Catherine's foreign policy was characterized by pragmatism. She sought peace with Spain when necessary, alliance with Protestant states when advantageous, and treaties with Italian and German princes to bolster France's position. She was no idealist. Her goal was always the preservation of the monarchy and the Valois dynasty, and she adapted her policies to the shifting realities of European power politics. While Catherine's regency was dominated by political and religious crises, she also cultivated a vibrant and dazzling court culture that served both to legitimize her rule and to distract from the grim realities of civil war. Catherine was a great patron of the arts, commissioning works from some of the finest artists, architects, and playwrights of her age. She understood that splendor and ceremony were essential tools of monarchy, reinforcing the sacred authority of the king and the grandeur of the French court. Among her most significant contributions was the construction of the Tuileries Palace in Paris, an ambitious project that would become one of the great landmarks of French architecture. Designed as a royal residence and a symbol of Renaissance elegance, the Tuileries reflected Catherine's taste for classical beauty and her desire to leave a lasting legacy. She filled her court with music, dance, theater, and elaborate festivals, creating an atmosphere of sophistication and cultural vitality, even as France tore itself apart in civil war. Catherine's patronage extended beyond architecture to the theater and ballet. She is often credited with introducing the Italian tradition of ballet to France, commissioning elaborate court spectacles that combined dance, music, and poetry. These entertainments were more than mere diversions. They were carefully staged demonstrations of royal power and harmony, designed to reinforce the authority of the monarchy and the legitimacy of her sons. Through her patronage, Catherine helped lay the foundations for the later cultural flowering of France under Louis XIV, who would perfect the use of spectacle and grandeur as instruments of royal control. Her cultural legacy, though often overshadowed by her political reputation, was profound and enduring, shaping the identity of the French court for generations to come. Yet, for all her efforts at governance, diplomacy, and cultural patronage, Catherine's regency was ultimately defined by the mounting crises she could not fully control. The wars of religion raged on, punctuated by brief, fragile truces and brutal massacres. The loyalty of the nobility was fickle, the stability of the monarchy ever precarious. Catherine herself was increasingly vilified by both Catholics and Protestants, seen by each side as the secret ally of the other. Her image as the Black Queen began to take shape, a figure of dark cunning and ruthless ambition, a convenient scapegoat for the failures of the age. Nonetheless, Catherine remained at the center of French politics throughout the reign of Charles IX and beyond. She would continue to guide her sons through the storms of civil war, navigate the treacherous waters of religious fanaticism, and fight, often against impossible odds, to preserve the crown and the dynasty she had dedicated her life to protecting. Her story during these years is one of extraordinary resilience, political ingenuity, and cultural sophistication. A queen mother whose influence shaped one of the most turbulent and fascinating periods in French history. The latter half of the 16th century plunged France into one of the most violent and chaotic periods in its history, a time when religious fervor, political ambition, and personal vendettas intertwined to devastating effect. At the center of this storm stood Catherine de' Medici, a woman whose political cunning, resilience, and determination to preserve the monarchy would shape the fate of the French nation. The rise of the Huguenots, the French Protestants who rapidly gained followers among the nobility and bourgeoisie, challenged the dominance of the Catholic Church, and, by extension, the very foundations of the French state. The Protestant Reformation had spread rapidly across Europe, and in France, it found fertile ground among a population disillusioned by corruption within the Catholic Church and eager for religious reform. The Huguenots were not a mere fringe movement. They included some of the most powerful noble families, such as the Bourbons and the Chatillons, whose influence rivaled that of the Catholic establishment. Faced with this explosive growth of Protestantism, Catherine sought to pursue a policy of limited tolerance, believing that open repression would only fan the flames of rebellion. In 1562, she issued the Edict of Saint-Germain, which granted a measure of religious freedom to the Huguenots, allowing them to worship openly outside city walls and to hold synods. It was a bold and dangerous move, an attempt to bring an end to the spiraling violence through compromise. Yet Catherine's policy was deeply unpopular among hardline Catholics, who viewed any concession to heresy as a betrayal of the true faith. Despite her intentions, the edict failed to prevent violence. Instead, it contributed to the polarization of French society, hardening attitudes on both sides. The issuance of the edict marked the beginning of the French Wars of Religion, a series of 8 brutal conflicts that would devastate the kingdom over the next 36 years. Skirmishes between Protestant and Catholic forces quickly escalated into open warfare. Towns were sacked, countryside laid waste, and massacres became common. Religious affiliation often served as a pretext for personal vendettas and political ambitions. Local feuds erupted into national crises, and no one, regardless of rank or loyalty, was safe from the chaos. Catherine, striving to maintain her precarious hold on power and to protect the monarchy, found herself walking a perilous tightrope between the competing forces tearing France apart. Mediation became Catherine's primary strategy. She sought to position herself as the neutral mother of the kingdom, a figure above sectarian strife. She organized religious colloquies and conferences, bringing Catholic and Protestant theologians together in a desperate attempt to find common ground. Her efforts, however, were constantly undermined by the deep theological and political divisions between the two camps. For many Catholics, the very existence of Protestantism was an affront to divine order that could not be tolerated. For Protestants, Catholicism represented a corrupt institution that must be purged. Catherine's vision of a moderate, pluralistic France was increasingly untenable. Marriage was another tool Catherine wielded in her efforts to forge peace. She arranged the marriage of her daughter Marguerite de Valois, known popularly as Queen Margot, to Henry of Navarre, a leading Protestant nobleman and heir to the Bourbon dynasty. This marriage, celebrated in Paris in 1572, was intended to symbolize the reconciliation between Catholics and Protestants, to heal the wounds of war with the bonds of family. It was a bold gamble, one that Catherine hoped would usher in a new era of peace. In arranging the union, she demonstrated her characteristic political pragmatism, willing to bridge even the deepest divides if it meant securing the future of the monarchy. The lead-up to the wedding, however, was fraught with tension. The streets of Paris teemed with armed men, Protestant and Catholic alike, and the atmosphere was thick with suspicion and fear. The gathering of so many Huguenot leaders in the capital, a city still fiercely Catholic, was seen by many Catholics as a provocation. Beneath the outward pageantry of the marriage celebrations, dark plots simmered. Catherine, caught between her desire for peace and the intractable hostility of militant Catholics, faced an impossible situation. Rumors abounded that a Huguenot coup was being planned. Some historians suggest that Catherine, fearing for her own life and the survival of her sons, felt she had no choice but to act. What followed was one of the most infamous events in European history, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. In the early hours of August 24, 1572, Catholic mobs, incited by leaders of the court and perhaps with the tacit approval of Catherine herself, began a systematic slaughter of Huguenot leaders gathered in Paris for the wedding celebrations. The killing quickly spread beyond the political elite to ordinary citizens, and for several days, Paris ran red with blood. Men, women, and children were dragged from their homes and murdered in the streets. The violence spread to the provinces, and within weeks, thousands of Huguenots had been killed across France. The role of Catherine de' Medici in the massacre has been the subject of intense historical debate. Some contemporaries and later historians portrayed her as the mastermind, the cold-blooded architect of the slaughter, a view that cemented her infamous reputation as the Black Queen. Others argue that Catherine was trapped by events, that she authorized a targeted strike against a few Huguenot leaders to prevent an uprising, only to see events spiral out of control beyond her intentions. Regardless of her exact role, the massacre marked a turning point in her reign and in the history of France. It shattered any remaining hope for peaceful coexistence between Catholics and Protestants. The massacres hardened sectarian identities and ensured that religious war would continue with renewed ferocity. In the aftermath of the massacre, Catherine's position became even more precarious. Internationally, France's reputation was deeply tarnished. Protestant states across Europe condemned the killings, and relations with England and the Protestant German princes soured. Domestically, the crown's authority was undermined. Protestants, who had once been willing to negotiate with the monarchy, now saw the Valois dynasty as irredeemably hostile. Even among Catholics, Catherine faced growing distrust, as militant factions accused her of not doing enough to stamp out heresy completely. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre fundamentally altered Catherine's reputation. Once seen as a pragmatic mediator, she was now depicted as a Machiavellian figure, embodying the worst stereotypes of Italian cunning and duplicity. She became a symbol of tyranny and treachery in Protestant propaganda, immortalized in lurid pamphlets and polemical histories. This image would persist long after her death, coloring the way generations would view her life and reign. Despite the catastrophe, Catherine continued to exert influence over French politics, though with diminishing effectiveness. The monarchy's authority steadily declined in the years following the massacre. The young king, Charles IX, was deeply traumatized by the events and grew increasingly unstable. He died in 1574, leaving the throne to his younger brother, Henry III, a man whose reign would be dominated by further religious wars and internal strife. Catherine, now queen mother to her third son to sit on the throne, once again found herself in the position of chief advisor and de facto ruler. Henry III's reign was marked by even deeper fractures within French society. The Catholic League, a militant organization dedicated to the eradication of Protestantism, grew in power and influence, challenging the authority of the crown. Led by the Guise family, the League sought to impose a hardline Catholic regime on France, even at the cost of undermining royal authority. The League's growing strength made it increasingly difficult for Catherine and Henry III to pursue moderate policies. They found themselves caught between the League's demands for total war against heresy and the necessity of negotiating with Protestant nobles to maintain any semblance of national unity. Meanwhile, the Huguenots, though battered by decades of violence, remained a potent force. Under leaders like Henry of Navarre, they continued to resist Catholic domination, fighting not only for their religious freedom, but also for political power. The kingdom descended further into chaos, with battles, assassinations, and betrayals becoming routine features of political life. France was no longer merely a battleground between two faiths. It was a nation tearing itself apart at every seam. Catherine's influence waned as Henry III increasingly sought to assert his independence. Though she continued to advise him, her ability to control events diminished. She worked tirelessly to broker compromises, to forge alliances, to hold the kingdom together with the force of her will. But the forces of fanaticism, ambition, and vengeance were too great. The monarchy she had dedicated her life to preserving teetered on the edge of collapse. By the late 1580s, Catherine was an old woman, worn down by decades of conflict and personal loss. Her health deteriorated, but she remained active in politics until the very end. She traveled extensively across France, negotiating with rebellious nobles, attempting to mediate between her son and the increasingly aggressive Catholic League. Her final years were marked by frustration and sorrow as she witnessed the disintegration of the kingdom she had fought so hard to hold together. Catherine de' Medici died in January 1589, just months before the assassination of Henry III and the end of the Valois dynasty. She did not live to see the ultimate triumph of Henry of Navarre, the Protestant prince who would convert to Catholicism and become Henry IV, inaugurating the Bourbon dynasty and finally bringing a measure of peace to France. Her death marked the end of an era, a period of bloodshed, intrigue, cultural brilliance, and political complexity that would leave an indelible mark on French history. Catherine's legacy is profoundly ambivalent. She was a woman who rose to extraordinary heights in a male-dominated world, a consummate politician who navigated the treacherous waters of court life with intelligence and determination. She sought to preserve the monarchy and maintain the unity of France in the face of almost insurmountable challenges. Yet her policies, compromises, and occasional ruthlessness contributed to the very instability she sought to prevent. Her reputation as a scheming, Machiavellian figure is both a reflection of the political realities she faced and a testament to the enduring power of propaganda in shaping historical memory. In the end, Catherine de' Medici remains one of the most fascinating and controversial figures of the Renaissance. A queen mother whose life and reign encapsulated the grandeur, tragedy, and complexity of a France riven by faith, ambition, and civil war. The death of Charles IX in 1574 marked another shift in the troubled trajectory of France during one of its darkest periods. With his passing, Catherine de' Medici faced the task of guiding yet another of her sons through the minefield of politics, religion, and civil unrest that had become the defining feature of the French monarchy. Charles IX had left no heir, and his short, tormented reign, scarred by violence, guilt, and mistrust, came to a sorrowful end. His successor, Henri III, was both familiar and distant to Catherine. Having spent time in Poland as king of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, he had become somewhat detached from the intricate politics of the French court. Upon his return to France to assume the throne, Catherine stepped once more into the role she had occupied for much of her life: guardian, guide, and architect of royal survival. Henri III, although intelligent and cultured, was also temperamental, introspective, and prone to bouts of indecision. Catherine's influence during the early years of his reign was profound. She had shaped his upbringing and molded his understanding of politics. He trusted her judgment and often relied on her advice, especially when it came to navigating the treacherous religious divides still fracturing France. However, unlike his brothers, Henri sought greater autonomy. While he respected his mother, he increasingly wished to assert his own authority and to shape his rule according to his own vision of kingship. The tension between his need for independence and Catherine's enduring political role would become one of the subplots of his reign. The kingdom Henri inherited was far from stable. The Protestant Huguenots remained a formidable presence, but a new threat had emerged in the form of the ultra-Catholic League, led by the powerful House of Guise. The League, fiercely committed to the eradication of Protestantism, grew bolder with each passing year. Supported by Spain, particularly by King Philip II, the Catholic League increasingly operated as a state within a state, challenging the authority of the crown and pushing Henri III into a dangerous corner. Catherine, ever the pragmatist, sought to negotiate a middle path, attempting to balance the interests of Protestants and Catholics while preserving the crown's fragile legitimacy. Yet the tide was turning. The extreme partisans on both sides were no longer interested in compromise, and Catherine's policies of moderation came under heavy fire from all quarters. Spain's interference further complicated the picture. The Habsburgs saw an opportunity in France's weakness and supported the Catholic League as a means to extend their influence. Catherine understood the grave implications of foreign meddling, especially from Spain, whose ambitions in Europe were vast. She urged Henri to resist Spanish influence and to preserve French sovereignty at all costs, but her son's position was growing more precarious with each passing year. The pressure from the League intensified, and the monarchy was seen increasingly as weak, indecisive, and vulnerable. In this climate, even the once effective strategies of negotiation and political marriage began to fail. Amidst the external crises, Catherine's personal life was a tapestry of sorrow and loss. One by one, her children and allies succumbed to death, illness, or political defeat. She had already lost her eldest son, Francis II, as a teenager. Charles IX had died young, his health and sanity destroyed by the burden of kingship and the trauma of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. Her daughters, married off across Europe, were distant and often embroiled in their own courtly dramas. Henri III, though close to her in many ways, was surrounded by a coterie of favorites who often excluded her from the inner workings of his rule. Catherine's influence, though still significant, was no longer absolute. She felt the loss of control acutely and worked tirelessly to maintain her relevance, even as the tides of power shifted around her. The Valois court in these later years took on a character of both theatrical excess and dangerous intrigue. Henri III's court became notorious for its extravagance and decadence, with lavish banquets, elaborate costumes, and displays of wealth that jarred with the suffering of the wider population. Catherine, though deeply pious in her own way and committed to the dignity of monarchy, was not immune to these trends. She understood the importance of spectacle in maintaining royal authority, and often participated in, or supported the theatricality of court life. Yet beneath the glittering surface, the court was a nest of vipers. Rumors of corruption, poisonings, and occult practices abounded. Catherine herself, thanks in part to her Italian origins and the ever-present suspicion of foreigners, was frequently accused of dabbling in witchcraft and employing poison to eliminate her enemies. These allegations, while largely unfounded, stuck to her reputation like a stain. The popular imagination, fueled by pamphlets, hostile writings, and Protestant propaganda, painted her as a scheming sorceress, a dark queen ruling from the shadows. Every unexplained death, every sudden illness at court, was attributed to her secret machinations. She was accused of manipulating events through astrology, of consulting necromancers, and of orchestrating death with calculated precision. While there is no credible evidence that she engaged in such practices, the myth proved more durable than the truth. Her patronage of Italian physicians, alchemists, and astrologers added fuel to the fire, as did her reputation for political cunning. Despite these attacks, Catherine continued her tireless work behind the scenes, fighting to keep the monarchy afloat. She traveled across the country well into her 60s and 70s, enduring long journeys, poor accommodations, and frequent illness in her efforts to secure loyalty and negotiate peace. Her correspondence with governors, nobles, foreign envoys, and religious leaders was voluminous. Her stamina, both physical and mental, was extraordinary, especially considering the burdens she had carried for decades. Yet the world around her was crumbling. The royal authority she had spent her life trying to preserve was now openly defied. The Catholic League controlled entire regions. Protestant nobles declared their independence. The streets of Paris were dangerous, filled with armed men loyal not to the king, but to rival factions. As the 1580s wore on, Catherine witnessed the slow disintegration of the dynasty she had fought to protect. Her hopes for a strong, unified France ruled by her sons were dashed. One by one, her dreams had died with her children, and what remained was a monarchy in name only. In 1588, the crisis reached a boiling point when Henri III ordered the assassination of Henry, Duke of Guise, leader of the Catholic League. This desperate act, carried out in secret, shocked the nation and destroyed what little support the king had left among his Catholic subjects. The Guise family had been immensely powerful, and their elimination unleashed a torrent of retaliation and unrest. Paris rose in open rebellion. Henri III was forced to flee the capital. Catherine, already ill, was devastated by the turn of events. The kingdom she had worked so hard to hold together was now a battlefield ruled by warlords, religious fanatics, and foreign agents. Catherine died on January 5, 1589, at the Château de Blois. She was 70 years old. Her death marked the end of an era, not only for the Valois dynasty, but for a particular vision of monarchy, a monarchy governed by reason, diplomacy, and careful balance between faiths. There was no triumph in her passing, no sense of victory or peace. France was broken, torn apart by nearly 3 decades of civil war, with no clear path forward. Henri III, the last of her sons to reign, would be assassinated just a few months later. The Valois line would die with him. The monarchy she had preserved through war, betrayal, and heartbreak collapsed into uncertainty. Her legacy was already tarnished before her death. While some contemporaries admired her tenacity and skill, many others saw her as a symbol of everything wrong with France. The corruption of the court, the endless war, the duplicity of royal policy. In Protestant lands, she was vilified as the butcher of St. Bartholomew, the wicked queen who murdered innocents in the name of power. Even among Catholics, she was viewed with suspicion. Her tolerance of heresy, her reliance on foreign advisors, her ambiguous role in courtly conspiracies, all of these fed the perception that she was untrustworthy. Historians and commentators over the centuries would continue to debate her motives, her actions, and her morality. Yet to dismiss Catherine as merely a villain is to miss the full complexity of her life and role. She governed in an age when women were expected to remain silent, obedient, and ornamental. Instead, she wielded power with remarkable skill, navigating an almost impossible set of circumstances. She protected her children, sustained the monarchy, and worked relentlessly for peace in a time when compromise was viewed as weakness. Her political acumen, her deep understanding of human psychology, and her capacity for endurance were extraordinary. Few rulers in history have faced such sustained crises, and fewer still managed to hold power for so long in the face of relentless opposition. Catherine's death did not bring closure to France's long ordeal. The wars of religion would continue for nearly another decade. Only with the accession of Henry IV, formerly Henry of Navarre, would the country finally begin to heal. He would convert to Catholicism, famously declaring that Paris is well worth a mass, and issue the Edict of Nantes in 1598, granting limited toleration to Protestants. It was a policy Catherine herself might have supported, yet the Bourbon monarchy that Henry IV founded stood in contrast to the fragile Valois dynasty she had upheld. Where her sons were beset by indecision, Henry was bold and pragmatic. Where Catherine negotiated endlessly, he acted decisively. The world had changed, and her methods, so effective in the past, were no longer suited to the new age. Nevertheless, her legacy endures. She left a deep mark on French political culture, courtly rituals, and the very concept of queenship. She helped bring Italian Renaissance ideas to France, promoting art, architecture, cuisine, and intellectual exchange. The cultural life of the Valois court, despite its turmoil, was rich and vibrant, thanks in large part to her patronage. Her vision of a pluralistic, moderate France may have failed in practice, but it anticipated the compromises that would eventually end the wars she tried so hard to prevent. Catherine de' Medici remains one of the most enigmatic figures in European history. Neither hero nor villain, she was a product of her time, a survivor of brutal power struggles, and a masterful practitioner of political realpolitik. Her life is a mirror of 16th-century France itself, brilliant and brutal, cultured and cruel, full of ambition and tragedy. She lived not in a world of absolutes but in the gray space where power, faith, and survival intersect. In that space, she did what she believed necessary. Not always rightly, not always successfully, but always with the fierce love of a mother and the steely resolve of a sovereign. Catherine de' Medici's life, actions, and legacy have been the subject of both historical examination and widespread myth-making, with much of the latter contributing to what is known as the Black Legend. The narrative surrounding her has been shaped by her enemies, her political opponents, and the volatile atmosphere of 16th-century France, where religion, power, and survival were constant and often violent considerations. Many myths have been associated with Catherine, some of which she did little to dispel, and others that were exaggerated or entirely fabricated, casting her as a figure of darkness, intrigue, and malevolent influence. Among these legends, the most enduring are those that portray her as a poisoner, a manipulator of the occult, and a ruthless political schemer who used any means necessary to maintain power. These tales, although part of the historical fabric, require scrutiny and reassessment to distinguish the reality of Catherine's actions from the sensationalized myths that have surrounded her. One of the most persistent myths about Catherine is her alleged role as a poisoner. This legend ties into the broader historical context of fear and fascination with poisons during the Renaissance and the early modern period. In a time when political power was often fragile and short-lived, poisoning was seen as a covert and effective method of eliminating rivals. Catherine's Italian background, along with the widespread Italian association with poison in Renaissance Europe, provided a fertile ground for such rumors. Her Medici family had been embroiled in numerous scandals and power struggles, and several of her relatives had been accused of poisoning enemies. This context undoubtedly contributed to the myth of Catherine as a poisoner, especially in the wake of the deaths of several key figures in the court and her circle. One such infamous death was that of her close ally and one of the most powerful figures in her reign, the Duke of Guise, whose assassination in 1588 was linked to intrigue and courtly conspiracy. Following his death, rumors swirled about Catherine's possible involvement in a plot to eliminate him. The theory that she used poison to orchestrate such a death was fueled further by other unexplained deaths at court, many of which were blamed on her supposed involvement in the dark arts. Yet, no concrete evidence ever substantiated these accusations. In fact, many of the alleged poisonings may have been natural deaths, sudden illnesses, or the result of political maneuvering. Catherine, a shrewd and capable ruler, was often the target of rumors and conspiracies, many of which were aimed at discrediting her influence, particularly as she was a woman in a deeply patriarchal society. This focus on her alleged poisonings overshadowed her true political achievements and reduced her complex character to that of a villain in the eyes of many. In addition to the accusations of poisoning, Catherine's interest in astrology and the occult also played into the development of her Black legend. The 16th century was a period in which astrology and the mystical arts were deeply integrated into the lives of European elites. The courts of Europe were rife with astrologers, alchemists, and seers, many of whom were consulted for advice on political matters, royal marriages, and military strategies. Catherine was no different. She regularly consulted astrologers, and her reliance on them has been a source of historical debate. Among the most famous figures associated with her court was Nostradamus, the renowned astrologer who became one of Catherine's trusted advisors. Nostradamus was known for his cryptic prophecies, many of which have been interpreted in various ways over the centuries. While some of his predictions were not particularly accurate, his association with Catherine lent an air of mysticism to her reign, adding to the aura of intrigue that surrounded her. Nostradamus, who became Catherine's personal astrologer, was one of the most prominent figures in the court of the Valois kings. He advised Catherine on matters of state, and even suggested auspicious dates for significant royal events, such as coronations and battles. Some scholars argue that Catherine's reliance on astrology was a reflection of the period's fascination with the mystical, while others suggest that it was a pragmatic tool she used to make decisions in an uncertain and dangerous political landscape. Nostradamus's prophecies, which were often vague and open to interpretation, further added to Catherine's mystique. The idea that she was guided by an astrologer's predictions fed into the myth of a queen who manipulated fate through supernatural means. This portrayal of Catherine as someone who sought guidance from the stars served to undermine her political acumen, reducing her complex strategies to a mere reliance on mystical forces. The widespread belief in Catherine's occult practices, including the supposed use of black magic, was also tied to the era's deep-rooted superstitions and fears. As a foreign-born queen, Catherine was often viewed with suspicion by the French court, particularly by the nobility, who saw her as an outsider. Her Italian heritage, combined with her reliance on astrologers, physicians, and other unusual advisors, made her an easy target for accusations of witchcraft and dark dealings. Throughout history, Italian women, particularly those from powerful families like the Medici, were often depicted as sorceresses or manipulators, fueling the perception that Catherine might have wielded secret and nefarious powers to secure her position. In reality, much of what has been written about Catherine's alleged involvement in astrology and occult practices has been exaggerated or misunderstood. While it is true that she had a keen interest in astrology, as was common among many of her contemporaries, there is no evidence to suggest that she used it in any nefarious way or that she relied on magic to govern. Catherine's use of astrology was consistent with the intellectual trends of the Renaissance and early modern period, where the alignment of the stars was often seen as a key element in understanding the course of human events. Her reliance on astrologers and seers should be understood in the context of the time, rather than as an indication of some supernatural agenda. The portrayal of Catherine de' Medici as a villainess has been further compounded by the political necessity of some of her most controversial decisions. Throughout her reign as queen and queen mother, Catherine was forced to navigate a perilous landscape marked by religious conflict, political factionalism, and foreign intervention. Her decisions, such as her role in the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, have been heavily scrutinized and often viewed through a lens of moral judgment. However, to understand these actions requires a more nuanced approach. Catherine's decisions were not made out of malice, but out of a desire to preserve her family, her dynasty, and her nation in a time of unprecedented turmoil. In a world where the survival of the monarchy often depended on quick, decisive action, Catherine made choices that were aimed at maintaining the delicate balance of power. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, in particular, is often cited as the most damning example of Catherine's supposed ruthlessness. While it is true that she was involved in the decision to execute a massacre of Huguenot leaders in 1572, the motivations behind her actions were far more complicated than a simple desire for bloodshed. Catherine saw the growing power of the Huguenots as a threat to the monarchy and feared that the Protestant rebellion could lead to civil war or foreign intervention. Her decision to authorize the massacre was a desperate attempt to maintain the balance of power, even if it led to an unthinkable tragedy. The massacre itself, which resulted in the deaths of thousands of Huguenots, was a moment of brutal, tragic violence, but it must be seen within the context of the political pressures that Catherine was facing. Catherine's portrayal as a villainous, power-hungry queen ignores the political reality in which she operated. She was a woman in a male-dominated world, seeking to preserve not only her own survival, but also the future of her children and the legacy of the Valois dynasty. Her decisions were often dictated by pragmatism, not cruelty, and her political maneuvering was driven by the desire to protect the fragile monarchy, not a lust for power. By reassessing her actions with a more nuanced understanding, we can begin to see Catherine not as a villain, but as a queen who was forced to make difficult, sometimes tragic choices in a world of political and religious chaos. Ultimately, Catherine de' Medici remains one of history's most misunderstood figures. While myths of poison, astrology, and dark magic have overshadowed her reign, a closer examination reveals a monarch who was deeply engaged in the political and cultural life of her time. She was a woman who wielded power in a turbulent and dangerous era, and who used her intellect and cunning to navigate the complexities of courtly life and statecraft. Her legacy is not one of villainy, but of survival, resilience, and the complex realities of monarchy in a time of religious and political upheaval. Catherine de' Medici's impact on history is immense, both in the context of her time and in the long-term trajectory of European politics. As a woman in an overwhelmingly male-dominated world, her ability to rise to power, influence political affairs, and navigate the treacherous waters of French court life speaks to her extraordinary political acumen and resilience. However, her legacy has been shaped by both her accomplishments and the myths that surround her. In her lifetime, Catherine was a queen mother, regent, and power broker, who played a key role in shaping the future of France and, by extension, Europe. Her political prowess allowed her to survive and thrive in an environment that often viewed women in positions of power with suspicion and disdain, and her decisions left a lasting imprint on French and European history. In an era dominated by powerful male monarchs, Catherine de' Medici proved herself to be a formidable force, adept at balancing the competing factions at court while holding her own as a female ruler. Her ability to command influence and navigate the intricacies of court politics is even more remarkable considering the challenges she faced as an outsider. Born into the Medici family in Italy, she was not originally considered to be the powerful figure she later became. Unlike the other great female monarchs of her time, such as Elizabeth I of England and Mary, Queen of Scots, Catherine did not inherit power through direct succession. Instead, she gained it through marriage and the exercise of deft political strategy. Her marriage to Henry II of France and subsequent role as queen consort put her in a position of relative power, but it was her later years as queen mother and regent that truly defined her legacy. Catherine's political career, particularly her role as queen mother to her sons, was marked by constant negotiation and manipulation of power. Her ability to maintain control during the tumultuous French wars of religion, in which Catholics and Protestants fought for supremacy, is a testament to her political acumen. While Elizabeth I of England is often lauded for her strategic handling of the Protestant Reformation, Catherine similarly faced the challenge of managing the religious divide in France. Like Elizabeth, she had to balance the interests of various factions, from the Catholics to the Huguenots, while ensuring the survival of her dynasty. Both queens faced significant threats to their rule, Elizabeth from external forces like Spain and Mary from internal strife, and both women had to find ways to exercise power within the confines of a patriarchal society. Yet Catherine's legacy as a ruler is often overshadowed by the darker myths that surround her, while Elizabeth's reign is more frequently celebrated. This contrast highlights the challenges Catherine faced in being taken seriously as a political leader in a world where women were rarely afforded such agency. Catherine's influence extended far beyond her personal political achievements. Her decisions had profound consequences on the future of France. One of her most significant contributions was her role in the shaping of the Bourbon dynasty. Through her political maneuvering, Catherine ensured the continued prominence of the Valois family, even after the disastrous St. Bartholomew's Day massacre and the subsequent decline of the Valois dynasty. By securing the marriage of her daughter Marguerite de Valois to Henry of Navarre, the future Henry IV, she helped pave the way for the eventual triumph of the Bourbon family over the Valois. This strategic marriage, although fraught with conflict and religious tension, ultimately led to the Bourbon ascendancy, which brought stability to France after the turbulent wars of religion. Despite Catherine's efforts to secure the future of the Valois dynasty, the eventual decline of the family and the rise of the Bourbons was inevitable, given the political and religious upheavals of the time. The dynastic struggles, compounded by the growing strength of Protestant factions, weakened the Valois family and undermined its ability to maintain control over France. Catherine's own legacy was tied to this dynastic shift, as her children's inability to maintain the monarchy's strength ultimately led to the Bourbon rise. Though her decisions were designed to secure her family's legacy, the outcome was not as she intended. However, it was this very downfall that made way for the Bourbon family, whose reign brought France into a new era. Catherine de' Medici's place in history is not limited to her political maneuvering, however. She also occupies a unique and often romanticized space in popular culture. Her life has been depicted in countless books, films, and television shows, often as the embodiment of political intrigue, ruthless ambition, and maternal devotion. This portrayal has cemented her status as one of history's most fascinating figures. The Black Queen moniker, often used to describe Catherine, is a product of the dark and tragic events that marked her reign, particularly the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, where thousands of Huguenots were killed. This event, along with the religious and political chaos of her time, contributed to her portrayal as a villainous and sinister figure, even though the reality of her actions was far more complex. In popular culture, Catherine is frequently shown as a scheming queen mother, controlling the destinies of her sons and manipulating those around her to maintain power. These depictions, while not entirely inaccurate, often focus on the more sensational aspects of her life and ignore the nuanced political decisions she had to make to navigate such a volatile period in French history. The fascination with Catherine's life and legacy continues to captivate audiences, who are drawn to the intrigue and complexity of her character. The portrayal of Catherine in works of fiction often leans heavily into her darker qualities, making her an archetype of the ruthless and ambitious monarch. This image has been reinforced by films like The Man Who Would Be Queen and TV shows like Reign, where Catherine is often portrayed as a villain. While these portrayals take artistic license, they also reflect the enduring fascination with her life and the mystery that continues to surround her legacy. Catherine de' Medici's story is one of survival, ambition, and political manipulation, set against the backdrop of one of the most tumultuous periods in European history. Her name endures not only because of her actions, but also because of the myths and legends that have been built around her, shaping her legacy as the Black Queen in the popular imagination. In reality, Catherine de' Medici was a complex and multifaceted ruler, whose impact on history was far-reaching and profound. While her reign was fraught with controversy, she remains a pivotal figure in the history of France, shaping the future of the monarchy and influencing the course of European politics. Her ability to navigate a male-dominated world, secure her dynasty's future, and leave a lasting imprint on French history speaks to her political skill and determination. Catherine de' Medici's legacy, both in history and popular culture, reflects the challenges faced by a woman in power during a time when women were rarely afforded the opportunity to rule. Her story is one of triumph and tragedy, and her place in history as one of the most enigmatic figures of the Renaissance and early modern period is assured. Catherine de' Medici's legacy is one of complexity, shaped by a multitude of factors, from her early life marked by loss and instability to her strategic navigation of power as queen consort, queen mother, and regent. She was a woman who survived the tumultuous political and religious landscape of 16th-century France, managing to hold on to power despite overwhelming odds. Yet, the myths surrounding her reign, particularly her association with poison, witchcraft, and ruthless ambition, have overshadowed the more nuanced aspects of her legacy. These myths have often reduced Catherine to a villain, overshadowing the political necessity and skill that underpinned many of her decisions. To understand her legacy fully, history must look beyond the simplistic and sensationalized portrayals and recognize the depth of her actions and motivations. Catherine was a political survivor in an era when women had limited power. Born into the powerful Medici family, she faced early tragedy, losing both her parents at a young age and growing up in a world full of political intrigue and instability. By the time she entered the French court as the wife of Henry II, Catherine was far from the powerful and influential figure that she would later become. Her early years were defined by a cold and distant marriage, overshadowed by her husband's love for Diane de Poitiers and a constant struggle to produce an heir. Yet, these early struggles served as the foundation for the political acumen that Catherine would later display as the Queen Mother and Regent. Through sheer determination, she navigated the complexities of French court life, built alliances, and most importantly, secured the future of her children, ensuring the survival of the Valois dynasty despite its eventual decline. Catherine's political skill was perhaps most evident during the Wars of Religion, a time of profound religious conflict between the Catholics and the Huguenots. As a mother and regent, Catherine faced the impossible task of maintaining peace and unity in a fractured France while balancing the needs and demands of competing factions. Her attempt to mediate between the Catholics and Protestants, as well as her political marriages, were part of a larger strategy aimed at preserving the power of the Valois family. Yet, her involvement in the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, an event that led to the slaughter of thousands of Huguenots, cast a long shadow over her legacy. While some historians argue that Catherine played a pivotal role in planning the massacre, others suggest that she was trapped by the events and was trying to salvage a rapidly deteriorating political situation. Either way, her legacy became tarnished, and she was forever associated with ruthlessness and political scheming. Yet, it is essential to recognize that Catherine's actions were not born of malevolent intent, but rather of necessity. Throughout her life, she was forced to make decisions in an environment where political survival depended on skillful manipulation of factions, alliances, and power dynamics. Catherine was not simply a woman who sought to accumulate power for its own sake. Rather, she was a queen who saw the preservation of her family and her dynasty as her primary responsibility. The decisions she made were often shaped by the dire political circumstances she faced, and it is in this context that her actions must be viewed. Her manipulation of power, while at times morally questionable, was often a product of the limited options available to her as a female ruler in a patriarchal society. Furthermore, history must view Catherine beyond the lens of villainy that has often been imposed upon her. The portrayal of Catherine as the Black Queen, a moniker coined largely due to her association with political intrigue and the bloody events of the French Wars of Religion, oversimplifies her life and legacy. She was not a one-dimensional figure, but rather a woman who made difficult decisions, some of which resulted in tragic outcomes. Like many rulers of her time, Catherine had to balance competing interests, navigate the treacherous political landscape of the French court, and protect her family from external and internal threats. Her decisions were often motivated by a desire to ensure the survival of her dynasty and to stabilize a fractured nation, rather than by malice or a thirst for power. While Catherine's reign was fraught with tragedy, it is important to acknowledge the broader context of her legacy. She was a key figure in the shaping of France during a pivotal moment in European history. Her political maneuvering ensured the continuation of the Valois dynasty, even if it was ultimately replaced by the Bourbon family. The marriages she arranged, including that of her daughter Marguerite to Henry of Navarre, paved the way for the eventual ascension of the Bourbons, which led to a period of stability for France after the Wars of Religion. This was a remarkable achievement, especially given the chaos that marked much of her reign. Catherine's legacy as a queen and mother, while marred by controversy, must be understood within the broader framework of her time and the limitations placed upon her as a woman in power. Catherine's final years were marked by personal tragedy, as she witnessed the deaths of her children and the decline of the dynasty she had fought so hard to preserve. Yet, even in her final years, she remained a force in the court, her influence never fully waning despite the growing power of the Bourbon family. When she died in 1589, she left behind a country still torn by religious conflict and political instability, but also one that had been shaped by her strategic decisions. In the years following her death, her reputation would continue to be shaped by the legends and myths that had taken root during her lifetime. Yet, it is crucial that we separate the woman from the legend and recognize her as a ruler who, despite the odds, fought for her family and her nation. Catherine de' Medici was a queen forged by necessity and tragedy. Her legacy is one of political survival, resilience, and, above all, a complex understanding of power. While history has often viewed her through the lens of villainy, it is essential to see her as a woman who was shaped by the tumultuous times in which she lived. Her decisions, while sometimes controversial, were driven by the need to protect her family and preserve the fragile stability of France. Catherine de' Medici was not simply a villainous figure, but a powerful queen who faced immense challenges with remarkable political skill and determination. To fully appreciate her legacy, history must recognize her not as a mere caricature, but as a woman who navigated the treacherous waters of power, leaving an indelible mark on the history of France and Europe.